And now it's Deborah Kobylt Live.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today on Deborah Kobylt Live. And joining me is Neil Gong, assistant professor of sociology at UC San Diego, who wrote this very powerful book, Sons, Daughters, and Sidewalk Psychotics. This is a very, very important book. It's very valuable for anyone to read this and get to understand what it is that we are going through here in Los Angeles, up in San Francisco, and up and down the board here in California. It's about mental illness and homelessness in Los Angeles. But honestly, this book sort of resonates everywhere. So thank you very much for joining us, Neil.
Thanks so much for having me, Deborah. I'm excited to be here and speak to an LA audience, especially. I know, of course, you
Yeah.
also have listeners and viewers all across the board, but especially for a California audience.
Yeah, this is critical for anyone because look, just so many years ago, there were homeless people, people sadly with pretty severe mental illness who would end up on the streets, living on the streets, in and out of treatment. And the big question is why? Why is it getting worse? And I know that you dive deep in this book about it. And in fact, you've also noted that in 2022, LA County had the largest population of homelessness pretty much from anywhere. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, and I mean, that fluctuates. It's kind of not the greatest mark of distinction, but yeah, it's quite explosive. And what's really remarkable about LA is that we have mass homelessness outside. So you have cities like New York that also have comparable rates of homelessness, but because they have a gigantic shelter system, it's not just people spilling out onto the streets in the way we have in a city like Los Angeles or some parts of Northern California as well.
Well, let me ask you that. You said they have a gigantic shelter system. In New York, do they sort of tell people who are homeless, look, you got to go for treatment? Because as you know, here, it's not that way. And then we're going to get into that. Could you answer to that?
Yeah, sure. So they don't. It's not as though if you refuse the shelter bed, you'll automatically be forced into treatment. So no, people comfortably have rights there to refuse a shelter bed or care. But it is just so much more widely available. It's a pretty different situation, and there are some differences in the mental health laws in New York, or
Right.
especially New York City versus California.
Could you go through that? Because that is interesting. I spent a tremendous amount of time in New York and LA, and I do not notice it quite as much in New York, in certain neighborhoods. And here in LA, it's in every neighborhood. And I'm not here to put down, certainly, anyone who's in that situation, because I've often believed that we're all just really one step away from that
Mhm.
situation. And I really do believe that. But I'd like to know what is it that you think are some of the primary differences?
Yeah, I mean, and it's important also to separate out. You have people who are on the streets for different reasons. Some people
Yes.
just get priced out. Rents have gone too high, comparable to their ability to bring in an income. Other people, it might be more related to drugs and serious mental illness. I mean, one of the
Yeah.
big differences in New York City, so as I mentioned, so there's this large shelter system. In fact, they have a state constitutional right to shelter. And so New York City has established this gigantic system. In terms of the mental health laws, they have assisted outpatient treatment, which is a
Mm,
kind of like forced treatment, but not you're getting stuck in a hospital. It's community based, and
right.
they established that earlier than I mean California also has a system like this, and LA has been
Mm,
experimenting with it, but they don't have it to uh, the same degree. They don't have it as robustly in LA compared to New York. So that's one difference is that there is more of a system for pushing people into treatment, at least in that aspect, than in
right.
California.
Hmm. Why doesn't get out Los Angeles get on that? Because you said Los Angeles is experimenting a bit with that. Why can't, if it's become somewhat successful in New York, why is it that that's something that we can't do? Is it bogged down in politics? What is it?
Yeah, it's several things. So one component is there's actually a lot of debate as to how effective that system is. So there is some
Mm,
evidence that people who go through that system in places like New York are having good outcomes, but it's hard to disentangle because in some cases those people are getting better resources than other folks are. So it's hard to disentangle. Is it because they were pushed into treatment, or it's just that they had access to something that somebody who was trying to get it voluntarily couldn't even get. So that's one reason why it's controversial. There's alongside that, there's the civil liberties issue. There's people argue that people shouldn't be forced into treatment unless they're past certain thresholds of being a danger to themselves or others. In many cases, people are, you think maybe they're on the cusp of harming themselves or being a danger to others, but they haven't passed that threshold legally. So there's the civil liberties aspect. There's also just to do that well is quite costly, and so yeah, there's quite a number of potential reasons, and then the politics of it. Yes.
Why do you think so many people, drug addicted, mentally ill, homeless, are in Los Angeles? Is it because they come here because they hear about it's easier to live on the streets here? Are they just put on a bus? I mean, what is the situation, in your
Well,
opinion?
so yeah, there is some, there's some anecdotal evidence about people being put on a bus, and I've encountered people who have said like, oh yeah, I was discharged from a hospital in Las Vegas and they sent me to LA. So there is
Wow.
some evidence of that, but actually most of the people who end up on the street are not transplants. It's in many cases, right? It's people who are in a given area and then they get priced out or they end up homeless. And then so it's not necessarily that we're just drawing people in. I mean, the other component really is about housing and housing availability. So if you look at places like Detroit, you have comparable rates of mental illness and addiction, but those people are addicted and struggling with their mental health indoors because there's more affordable housing stock. So in a place like LA, simply because we don't have enough affordable housing, people have those crises outdoors. So it's not necessarily that we're drawing people in. Part of it's just that we see them outside, whereas there's plenty of addiction in Arkansas, but it's there's more affordable housing, if that makes sense.
Hmm. But what do you do in a place like LA when housing is only going up? You can't smack the hand of a developer to say, you're going to build affordable housing. Because look, let's face it, we all know how that goes. Because I actually know some people who build them. And it's a giant building for affordable housing. But the fact is, very often there's just maybe one floor in the back for affordable housing. And the rest of the place is pretty darn nice and quite expensive. I mean, I don't really think that blocks and blocks and sections of LA are suddenly going to become affordable. Do you? I
No,
think it's getting worse.
yeah,
Yeah.
I don't think we're headed in that direction. And there are models from other parts of the world for designing either more affordable housing that's through the private market or having well-run public housing. Historically, in the United States, our public housing has often been disastrous. We've constructed these
Yeah.
giant buildings and stuck people in them, not put enough into maintenance or creating communities, and so sometimes these descend into quite awful places. But I will say I've also lived and traveled in places from France to Hong Kong, and I've seen very different kind of societies that have implemented public housing well, and they've done it in a way that's orderly, and can create safe environments. So it's not that it's impossible, but yeah, given the way Los Angeles is heading, yeah, I think you're correct. We're probably not going to develop a ton of affordable housing, although the state has been pushing back on some communities that have had a lot of NIMBYism that have tried to block the development of new apartments and things like this. So we might be inching in that direction, but you're right. We're not anywhere close to any sort of solution in terms of the housing component.
I mean, you talk about traveling. I've done the same, and I have seen very successful communities elsewhere. Certainly parts of Northern Europe have done a terrific job, some of those countries there. Um, Growing up back east, I remember seeing what we would call the welfare housing, these mega buildings that were built for people that were supposedly, for lower income housing. And you're right, it didn't really build a community. It just built this big thing for people to live in. But I mean, at least it was housing. And I look around LA, especially myself living in West LA, and I think, where are they going to put this? And
Mm-hmm.
I just wonder, is it maybe a better solution to maybe get out of LA, go a little bit east, and create really thriving, wonderful communities where there's more space? It doesn't seem like anyone is looking to do that where there is more space. They're just all infighting about how can we put it here. You know what I mean? Because sometimes I was talking about this last night at an event, and we were all scratching our heads like, how can this be done? I don't know. Could you answer to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've heard different arguments about this. I mean, I think certainly you're right that especially in places like West LA where there's not a lot of undeveloped land, unless you're going to be knocking down single family homes and starting to build apartment towers, it's going to be very hard to do there. So then the question is, how can you build more out? But then there becomes a question of, if jobs are available for people primarily in the city, how are they going to get there, especially if lower income folks who might not have access to cars? So it would require perhaps building a whole bunch of public transportation, which I'm open to, but of course that also presents problems. It's been so hard to do that in general in a place like LA. So there are certainly opportunities, I think, as you're saying, to go further east, and or it may end up being that we're going to have to build up. And then, because you do see these other types of cities that are quite dense. Singapore is a classic example of a city that's, on the one hand, very capitalist, or a city and a nation that's very, very capitalist, but they've also invested heavily in public housing. But it's these mega towers, which of course people in a place like Los Angeles who value their single family home neighborhoods are going to be opposed to, and understandably.
Yeah, but you mentioned Singapore. That's a real community, right? It's a community of people who don't want to see their people fail. They want to see their people thrive, and primarily one of our big issues here is we have such an incredible amount of people who are drug addicted, mentally ill. And let's face it, a lot of people are like, not in my neighborhood. So, it's sad because while nobody wants it in their neighborhood, it continues to grow, and then really impacts everyone because nobody wants it in their neighborhood. Well, then what do we do about it? It's still in the neighborhood. It's just on the sidewalk instead. It's very complicated. In your book, you talk about the different types of treatment. And I found it very interesting how you broke it down in one area, the rich versus the poor. Can we talk about first some of the public facilities that are out there for people? Is it being properly utilized? Is it enough? What do you think is working? Can we go through that first?
Sure, absolutely. So, in terms of is it enough? I mean, most definitely not. But I have seen programs that have been working quite well for what they do. And I'll explain it this way. So what I saw when I was with some of the county mental health services in downtown LA was I saw a lot of quite successful care, but in a very limited sense. So for a lot of these programs, what's called a county, like a full service partnership, this came out of the California State Mental Health Services Act. There are these treatment teams, and they have like a psychiatrist, social workers, nurses, like a whole team to help people who are living in the community. Sometimes they've been homeless, sometimes they've just gotten out of jail and they have a serious mental illness, help the person find housing. And then what they're trying to do is cope with all of these big social problems that we've been talking about, right? Like that they're trying to keep their client from becoming homeless again, from having an episode and ending up in jail, from ending up in the hospital during an emergency. And so these treatment teams are very good at things like figuring out how to find a person a place to live, process a housing voucher, deal with get people diverted so that they don't end up in state prison. And so they're very good at what I would call like guerrilla social work. Like they're doing whatever it takes to sort of keep people out of those crises and, get them into either some sort of group home or their own independent apartment. So that can be quite good in the sense that, in the hierarchy of needs, you've gotten somebody a stable place to live. You've gotten them out of that revolving door of the jail and the hospital and the street. But in many cases, while I have a lot of admiration for what they do in that regard, there's not a lot of therapeutic work after that. And it's hard to blame these workers. They're just struggling to keep their clients from cycling back to the street. And then if you want to look at,
then how do we continue with that treatment, right? How do we continue the flow so that those people who really made some progress, who really worked so hard, don't end up going back? Because mental illness, just like with alcoholism, people who go to, AA meetings, it's continuous. You've got to keep up the treatment. And it seems almost cruel and sad that all of a sudden it's like, okay, you're done. Bye-bye. Good luck. It just seems sad and cruel in a way. So what do we do to keep that going?
Yes. I mean, I think one thing is, of course, we need the resources to do that, because as it stands, as I talk to some of these workers, one of them told me, like, I know we're not that great at the rehabilitative side. It's just that once we've gotten one person stable, we have to move on to the next because there's someone else in crisis. They're just always putting out fires. What you would hope for is that they would be able to get somebody stable, and then not just stable, but also help them, because people want to go back to work. People want to have a life, reconnect with their families. And in many cases, the workers, they just have to focus on somebody else who's, yeah, on the verge of, heading to state prison or on the verge of becoming homeless again. They're dealing with evictions. They're dealing with crises. So in theory, there should be these kind of step down options where somebody leaves the intensive treatment and then they end up with something where perhaps there's vocational training to help them work again or find a job. But in many cases, that doesn't really happen. There's just not enough there. And so the public sector might get someone to a good baseline, but then
Right.
yes, there's not that kind of follow-up, which is, in contrast to when you see care for well-off people. Of course, it's this completely different world. They're not worrying so much about homelessness. They're not, I mean, occasionally people, get arrested during an episode, but you've already gotten them diverted. They're not necessarily caught up in the same kind of cycles. And so you can work on all these different types of therapies. So in addition to having, time with a psychiatrist to, find medications that work well for people, because in many cases, psych meds could either not work or with the wrong ones, people can have terrible side effects. Even with the right ones, you can have bad side effects. You need a doctor who can spend time with you to figure out proper dosage, or if you're even on the right thing, or if maybe you shouldn't even be on them. A lot of poorer folks don't get that kind of time, but that's one of the things money can buy is time with, a psychiatrist to really try to figure stuff out, but also all different kinds of psychotherapies that are specialized to what your needs are, as well as people who have the time to really develop a relationship with you, which is again just not usually true for poorer folks. And then one of the things that really caught me off guard was how many middle class people actually kind of fall through the cracks. Because
Yep.
if you to get these kind of support services from the county, you have to be like on public insurance, and you have to, in many cases, have already fallen through the cracks because the state has prioritized people with a history of homelessness, jail, or recent hospital discharge. And so if you're, like a middle class family, you have an adult child who's had a psychotic break, in many cases, you can't access that public care, but you find out that your private insurers, they don't want to cover a lot of intensive treatment. And so in some cases, it actually looks better to be on Medicaid. And then as far as the elite private care, many of those places don't want to take insurance at all. They don't want to deal with it. And the insurers don't want to cover it. And so it really ends up only being those who can pay quite a bit of money. And I talked to families who said, oh, well, we took a second mortgage on our home so we could put our adult child into private residential care that cost $1,000 a day, and we had them there, for a year. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of money, even for a stay in one of these Malibu centers that does mental illness and chemical addiction. They call it the dual diagnosis. You might be looking at $30,000+ a month, and so people go through their savings very fast. Even people who families that seem to be doing well, it can be quite a bit of money.
Oh my goodness. So I like to look at historically. How did we get here? Is it because obviously our drug situation is crazy, right? It's uncontrollable. It's everywhere. It's street corners. It's grown. It used to be back in the day. It was an addiction to alcohol, and you're smoking too much pot, and then now look where we are today. It's so multifaceted. We've got to get control of that, and we're not in control of that even whatsoever. Do you see a solution for that? I mean, in a way, it's sort of like you've got to draw a hard line, but nobody's doing that either. Like, what do we do?
Yeah, it's very complicated, right? So we'll start with the drugs, and then we can tackle the serious mental illness side and how they come together. I mean, in California, we kind of pioneered some harsh tactics, right? We pioneered 3 strikes and you're out. We had a real problem with and still do arguably with mass incarceration. We were putting a lot of people away. I mean, some of whom were committing violent crimes, but some of whom really weren't. And so we made this transition with Prop 47 around 2014, which essentially de facto decriminalizes possession of things like meth and heroin. And in some ways, that's really important, that we shouldn't be putting people who are, say, nonviolent drug offenders away for long stretches of time. But the idea was, okay, we're gonna make these things misdemeanors instead of felonies, the possession, and we're gonna have lots of good quality rehab, lots of good outpatient drug treatment. We're gonna help people, but all we did was we partially decriminalized, and then we let people out of prison. We never actually delivered on the care side. And so
That's
you
right.
have neither the harsh side nor the care side. You end up with nothing. You end up with
Yeah.
people on the street, and we're like, well, they, okay, then they're out there doing their thing. So that's a component of it. I mean, in terms of the connection to serious mental illness, there's some speculation that newer forms of meth are triggering psychosis more than they were in the past. So they're essentially making it look like people have schizophrenia symptoms. There's
Oh,
arguments about
wow.
whether that's true or not. It's hard to know exactly, but there does seem to be certainly a relationship where both people who are already experiencing psychosis end up smoking meth. Other people who didn't have those symptoms over time seem to develop them. So yeah, it's bad, and I'm not certainly not advocating that we return to just mass incarcerating folks for possession of drugs, but you can't simply start to decriminalize and not actually have something else in place, which would have been high quality addiction treatment, um, mostly voluntary. In some cases, it might have to be involuntary, but we ended up with really nothing in its place, in the place of the mass incarceration.
Hmm. I mean, you bring up a good point, but then, I'm going to go back a little further. How does this stuff get in here in the first place? What about really coming down hard on the suppliers? We just don't really seem to do a very good job at that. However, it's getting here on a shipping cart, over the border, whatever it is. And that's a big problem. And a lot of it's very political. I get it. It's like, no, no, we have to have open borders. And by the way, this is not about open or shut. That's not where I'm going here. I'm just saying we got to figure out something,
Sure.
wherever it's coming, and it's coming from multiple sources. um that's got to be, in my opinion at least, a very hard line. It's like, no,
Yeah.
we can't be selling this here anymore. And there's plenty of countries, you mentioned Singapore, that will just simply not allow it.
Yeah.
And how do we get to that point? Because if we don't, it's always going to be out there, and there's
Yeah.
always going
Yeah.
to be the addiction, and then it exacerbates the mental illness situation. It's just continuously going and getting worse. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, and this gets so complicated. So
It
Singapore, as
does.
an
It does.
example, where if you're caught there in other countries, if you're caught trafficking drugs, they might execute you, and that they're you can deter people by doing that. Is that the kind of country we want to live in? I mean, that's a real question. If we care about civil liberties as Americans, are we willing to have people executed for drug possession or for selling drugs? I mean, that's not the world I want to live in. But I think you're right that in terms of control, I mean, controlling supply that's its own very complicated thing. Like when we
Yeah.
tried to get other countries to shut down their drug production and selling to the United States. But in many cases, we have such a high demand here that people will try anything they can to circumvent our attempts and come here. And it's created a lot of chaos in other countries where now you have cartels battling the government and then working with the government, and we're paying their government to try to control it. So it's
Very
unfortunately, yeah, very
complicated.
complicated. Yeah, yeah. And a
The
lot
the
of civilians suffer
user
in other countries, yeah, because of that.
the user is not someone that I would prosecute. It's the people bringing it over. But you just mentioned the incredibly deep layers. And it's just it's wide, it's varied, it's deep. How do we go through it? You're right. It's very, very political. And then it leads me to wonder, is it ever really going to get better? Or is it just always going to be coming here? Sadly, the people who are really struggling end up on drugs, and they're the ones who are suffering. They're the ones in the street. They're the ones dying. They're the ones not getting the care. So, to your point, you know, your book is about getting the care, and how do we do that? Since you and I can't control how it's getting here, the thing to do is, try and do find the best treatments. What is a possible solution to this very, very complicated situation? Is it more families getting involved? We know that's complicated. A lot of families just put their hands up. Communities caring. Um, Everybody getting involved behind their, nice little fences and saying, I can't just sit here behind my fence. I got to get more involved, because if I don't like what's going on down the street, I got to do something about it. I mean, what's the answers to something like this?
Yeah, yeah. As you're sort of already implying, it's gonna take a lot of things. It's there's not a single one. It's gonna be a lot of it's kind of all hands on deck. So I think you're right. So part of it is communities coming together and saying, we want to do something different. So in some cases, that will mean we have to allow, the construction of a treatment center near us, as well as some housing. And as you mentioned earlier before too, it's not as though by not having the treatment center or housing, people are gone. They're just outside. So actually, the
Yeah.
treatment center plus the housing might make it less visible. and people would be getting help at the same time. So that potentially is a win-win. I think you also mentioned families. I saw families, well-off families, who were really struggling to make it through and figure out how to work these systems for their loved one. And even with the benefit of resources, it's so hard because we don't have a lot of support for those families. And so if you don't
Yeah.
have money, I met families who were people who they're trying everything they can, and they're sort of pulling out their hair, and it's almost like, do I have to give up on my loved one here because we don't actually have a lot of support for them? So it might also be some government support for the family members who are caring for the loved one who has a serious disability. Some of it is just that there isn't enough access to good services in general. So a big
Yeah.
component of it is going to be, expanding our high quality voluntary outpatient just clinics you can bring people to. Like I met people who were waiting long stretches of time to see a doctor. In the meantime of that, something that's kind of manageable suddenly becomes quite unmanageable. So we need to have
Yeah.
so that you have access kind of on demand. And then there is the other controversial part, which is what is the role of forced treatment? Do we need to return to something like when we're talking about history? For a long time in the United States, we had around 600,000 people in state hospitals. So in
Oh,
many cases, locked up against their will in asylums.
yeah.
And many of these
Oh,
places were awful, and
yeah.
we hear about the kind of the exposés. We see movies about these things. As
Cruel.
terrible as they were a place for people to stay, guaranteed food and shelter, um, a place to organize one's day. And the question is like, well, one question is, did all those people need to be there? I think clearly not. There are some people where we might try everything we possibly can as far as providing them high quality voluntary outpatient care. And if we've done that, I think we'll actually whittle down quite a bit of the people we're seeing on the street. Like sometimes we see someone and think, oh, that person needs to be taken away. If there was access to really high quality outpatient services, perhaps that person would have actually gotten into care before. We'll still have some remainder of people. And then the question is, if we do need to have things like state mental hospitals, how do we do it well? Because that's unfortunately
Right.
not part of the conversation enough. Is how do we make it so it's not a dungeon? How do we make it so it's not one flew over the cuckoo's nest?
How do we?
So yeah, I've got a few ideas on this. It's in the book, and I also had a Washington Post op-ed on this with one of my collaborators. So one of the things is that actually some of the folks who don't get listened to but have the best ideas for improving care are the people who have been through it, who have been through forced
Mm.
treatment, who have been on conservatorships. Um, in many cases, unfortunately, we think, well, why would we listen to that person? They've been dismissed already, and they've officially been considered crazy. But in many cases, they can speak to how treatment goes right or wrong. And
Hmm.
there's good evidence that when you force people into treatment and you don't treat them with dignity, people are humiliated. They feel traumatized by it. There's even some evidence that people go through hospitalizations and they're more likely to commit suicide afterwards.
Yeah.
They're more likely to no longer trust treatment providers because they felt like their autonomy was taken away. And so one of the things I've written about is trying to bring some of those folks in to help us redesign things. Like we could imagine, I mean, I've been on some psych wards that are terrifying.
Mm.
Could you imagine having somebody who's an architect who themselves has been 5150'd and placed on a psychiatric hold, and they can help us design a more open, safe feeling place that can balance the needs for you need a certain amount of security on a psychiatric unit, but you
Right.
also could have it be beautiful. You could have it feel healing. We could also make sure that if we're putting somebody on a court order, how do we make sure we're listening to their preferences, even if some of their rights have to be taken away? How do we make sure that as many of their preferences can be honored as possible? So that's actually a thing I've been working on a lot lately, is trying to figure out where if we do need to use forced treatment or asylums, there are these different ways we can make it a much better experience for people.
And honestly, it even helps if it just feels a little more homey. I'm involved with some organizations, they are nonprofits with, helping women get off the streets, particularly women with kids. And we go in and we actually try and make the housing
Mm,
really homey. blankets, and where it doesn't feel like some used blanket with a bunch of holes in it. It really
Absolutely.
is a new blanket and new sheets and curtains on the window that are cheerful. So people go in and say, "Oh wow," and they feel they're as human as you and as the two of us are. And it's disgraceful to me that people just think it's okay to just cast them aside and just take what we give you, including kind of lousy food. What about it costs, in my opinion, just about the same to prepare healthy food as it does kind of crappy food. So, with some dignity, to your point, we can build larger facilities or perhaps go into some that have been closed down and rehab them. I know it's expensive. See, I don't have the answers. This isn't
Hmm.
my field, but I do think about it a lot because I think it's terribly inhumane how we treat the people. A quick story. I once interviewed an actor, a very well known actor, during his time, but he became severely addicted. And he ended up on the streets and he ended up living in LA, on the side of the road at the 405 and Reseda, if you know that area, for nearly 7 years. And one day he looked down at his arm. As you can imagine, it was a mess, right? He was, shooting up, doing whatever it is that he was doing. And it's going to sound kind of awful, but he noticed ants, little
Mm.
ants going in one side of
Wow.
his arm and exiting the other. And he looked down, and I guess he had a moment where he was thinking clearly, and he thought, "What have I done to myself?" And somehow he ended on a bus. He doesn't remember how, and ended up at a county facility in Long Beach. This is some time ago. I will tell you, whatever happened to him then, the treatment helped him, and it worked. And he had been in and out of treatment many times, and he's doing quite well today. And it's been over a decade now. But could you imagine looking down?
Mm.
And this was a person who, his family couldn't handle him. He was in and out of treatment, but something clicked. We can't give up on people, I guess is what I'm saying, because he's now giving back to the community. To your point, he's been in that situation and he's trying to help others say, this is what worked for me. So we do have to listen to the people who have been there. It's so complicated. It's easy to drive down the street and say, "Oh, another encampment," but what are we doing about it? You know what I mean? This has become all of our, situation to get involved with. I
Yeah,
don't know.
yeah. I'm so glad
Um,
to hear that he's doing well, and to that point that he'd been through treatment. Yeah, in many cases it takes people a few tries, and so
yeah,
we need to be willing to uh, make that available. And then if it doesn't work in the first round, like have options, because people often, like they need maybe different types of therapies or different types of addiction treatment. Some people, what they're going to need in the meantime is clean needles, so that we're trying to control the spread of disease and keep people
right.
safe. But then later we're trying to get them. You don't stop the clean needles. You also want to have all these other kinds of intensive treatment options available, so people can try those when they're ready. Absolutely.
So you have some solutions that you've discussed. Are you being listened to? Are you talking to those in political power who can help with this, or nonprofits or large organizations, hospitals? Um, and have they been listening? Have they been hearing you?
Yeah, I've been speaking, I've had some exchanges with some folks in municipal governments, or I'll talk, I just recently gave a talk to a bunch of psychiatrists, and so some in terms of the level of individual practice. As far as policy change, sometimes I'll talk to people who will say, I agree with you, it's just going to be so hard to get the resources. We're in an interesting moment right now with Proposition 1. We're still not sure if it passed. This is, this $6 billion bond measure in California. And well, what's been interesting, and something I've been writing about and may have a piece coming out soon, is that you know Governor Newsom has talked about how we're going to get all this money, we're going to build these treatment beds, and what's kind of remarkable is how little has been said about the specifics. So we're going to have a certain number of residential treatment beds. Well, what kind of care are people going to get? And this is to that point we were just discussing, where if you do care poorly, it's not just that it'll go to waste, it could even backfire because you alienate people so much when they feel
That's
like they
exactly
have
right.
not been
Yeah.
respected, when it's not been dignified, when they haven't been listened to. So I'm hoping that there will be an opportunity if this passes. I mean, I know other people who think this, the way it's being financed is poorly thought out. Who knows what's going to happen if it does pass and the money is there? Yeah, I have some ideas for getting away from just the question of, how many beds do we build? It's like, well, what kind of treatment beds? What kind of services? How do we ensure that people are being treated with dignity, that they're getting the right kind of care, so that we don't waste this opportunity, that we make sure that people don't kind of fall back into terrible things that were happening to them before, and that it's not just we get them to this level, but we actually get them here and then on to living full lives again.
Mm. Anything else you'd like to add that I didn't ask you, that I didn't even know to ask you? That, I mean, this is your field of expertise, right? That you see us doing, moving ahead, or that we absolutely should be doing, or that people need to understand.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe just one thing I'll say, because you've mentioned that, we all drive down the street and we sort of see like, oh, this this is an eyesore, look at these folks who are out here. And the reason the book is titled Sons, Daughters, and Sidewalk Psychotics is because I think we all have this kind of two very different experiences around serious mental illness. Is that on the one hand, yeah, we have people who are the sidewalk psychotic, the person who's causing trouble, that we wish someone would take them away, or even if that's not our attitude, maybe our attitude is I have so much pity for this person, but we don't know them on a personal level. They're kind of this abstract problem that we need to deal with. I think a lot of us, and I think listeners can probably think of someone in their own life where actually our other experience around serious mental illness is a loved one from our family, a friend you grew up with who suddenly disappeared, and then you've only seen intermittently. Maybe even yourself, you've had a crisis and have, or maybe still struggling, or have managed to sort of claw your way out with help or without help. And I mean, I think it's so easy that we go down the street and we forget that that's somebody's loved one. And it could very well be that your own loved one ends up in that situation, right? Like, your child could have a psychotic break, and then there could possibly not be the resources in place for them. So this is a thing that's not just about people out there. It's also about people that we're connected to. And so that's just a kind of humanizing element that I always want people to remember is, that these are people, and that they're somebody's loved one, and it could even be you or your loved one at any time.
Yeah. Neil, thank you very much for joining us. There's so much, else I could ask you. When does so much of this start? When do we notice so much of the mental? You know what? Before we end, when do we often, if you could answer that for me, notice? It's sometimes I remember, my children when they were in school, and I could almost see. I am not a professional, okay, but I could almost see. I wonder if that person might have trouble someday down the road. I wonder what's going on. Can we get people early?
Yeah, this is a great question. It's a really important one. So with some forms of mental health troubles, yeah, you can spot it early and maybe have an early intervention. With the things that we consider more serious mental illness, like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, where people have psychotic episodes and become fairly separated from sort of consensus reality, that usually doesn't start happening until people are around between 18, 26, like in that sort of college age. And so it's hard to detect early, and there have been movements within psychiatry to try to have what they were calling like a psychosis risk syndrome diagnosis, like to try to identify people early. But it became quite controversial because there was fear that you would have some people who weren't going to develop a serious mental illness like a psychotic disorder, and they were going to start putting kids on medications too early. And a lot of these medications have quite serious side effects. There was also sort of fear that it could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Young people would start to look at themselves and think, oh, like, I'm a very sick person. I have to be scared of everything. And so there are risks to early identification and early intervention, at the same time that if done well, it could potentially be very important.
Do you feel like sometimes medicine is overprescribed? Because let's face it, at the end of the day, there's a large pharmaceutical company at the end who's profiting from this. So do you believe that sometimes doctors overprescribe and not really do the really hard work of therapy?
Yeah, I think that's certainly true, and it's and it's complicated, right? Like certainly not in all cases.
Yeah.
I think that we as a society have so there's on the one hand, from the consumer angle, there's kind of, oh, we want the simple solution, jump to a pill for myself or maybe for my family member. There's also, as you're saying, the pharmaceutical industry, and we have all the direct consumer advertising that, in some other countries, they don't even let the pharmaceutical companies advertise to people directly because they know that
Right.
then the person goes to the doctor and says, hey, I think I have this problem. Can you give me this thing? It's so complicated though, because at the same time that I think we've sort of over medicated some parts of society, there are other instances where a person really could benefit from the medications at the same
Right.
time. And around serious mental illness, it gets even more complicated because there are some people where the medications actually make them worse. We don't really understand how they work a lot of the times, and some people have terrible side effects. Um, Others, it has terrible side effects, but it still helps them. And so, there's no one size fits all here. I think we can both see that the medications can be helpful for people if they have, true informed consent. They get to know what the possible side effects are. They're given other options, including that a variety of therapies. For some people, it might be more important to have those therapies. For others, it might be a combination of things. But unfortunately, we tend to default to focusing on the meds. And we want a more holistic kind of approach where the meds are part of it, but they're not everything.
Holistic approach. I like that. Gosh, Neil, thank you for joining us. I could go on for another hour or two. I know that you have someplace to be, but this is such an important discussion. How can people get in touch with you and purchase your book?
Yeah, so they can just email me if they're curious. I really appreciate hearing from people. I've had recent email exchanges with patients as well as family members. So nmgong@ucsd.edu. That's my UC San Diego email address. Or if you just look up my website, neilgong.com, you'll find a way to get in touch with me. And yeah, I'd love to hear about people's experiences. I'm always learning so much from folks in terms of both other professionals of different sorts, but also just people who are going through these things themselves or what they've observed. And so,
Yeah.
Deborah, I want to say thank you for having me. Really enjoyed this conversation, and yeah, I'm glad to connect with your audience.
Yeah, and thank you to our friend Darlene Chan who connected us. She's a dear friend, and she knew that this was a topic that would be interesting not just to me but also to my audience. So thank you, and please reach out to Neil Gong. This is an important discussion. Everyone is affected, and perhaps just one or two people hearing this discussion might say, I'm going to get involved and figure out a way to do something somehow in some way. So thank you very much for this and for all the work you do. As a sociologist, it's important. We need more of you. So, yeah. So everybody, you can find our discussion with Neil Gong on all video and audio platforms of Deborah Kobylt Live. Please look up Neil. If you have a story, email him. I'd love to hear more about it. I'm just grateful that Neil joined us, and I hope that you learned something from our discussion today. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Tell your friends, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.